I think we've all suffered the prosperity, or the side effects thereof. Honorable Minister, Dr. Nigel Clark, Dr. Damian King, Executive Director of CAPRI, Dr. Dana Morris, Regional Manager of the JN Group, other distinguished guests, stakeholders, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephen Facey. I'm the CEO of the Pan Jamaican Investment Limited, but more importantly this evening, I am the recently appointed chairman of CAPRI's Board of Directors. And as such, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this CAPRI's annual budget review. There is always much discussion in the public sphere this time of year when our government is tabling its budget for the coming fiscal year. Changes are being highlighted by the media. Arguments are thrown on either side along partisan lines. And in the middle of all this, it can be difficult for us to really understand what is going on. That is why 3 years ago, CAPRI took on a project then called the Friendly Budget, which sought to design a framework for citizens to understand the key implications of a new budget. The first time around, it was presented right in the middle of Halfway Tree in Mandela Park. This year, we're in a slightly more cozier setting, but the goal is the same. Identify from the numbers and partisan posturing the key changes being made and what those changes really mean for us. For those who are not still familiar with CAPRI, we're a public policy think tank which exists to inform policy decisions in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, as well as to keep the public aware of the relevant evidence so that they can actively take part in policy-related debates. The second part of this mission is why we're here this evening. Our discussion today will begin with CAPRI's Executive Director, Dr. King, presenting the findings of this year's analysis. His presentation will be immediately followed by a response from the Honorable Minister before both are joined on a panel with Dr. Dana Morris Dixon and others, for a discussion during which you will be invited to ask questions. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this conversation is as lightening to all of us as I expect it will be. And I ask you now to join me in inviting to the stage Mr. Hugh Reid, financial consultant at the JN Group, who will be sharing a few words with us. Mr. Reid.
Dr. Damian King, Executive Director, CAPRI. Mr. Hugh Johnson, President, Small Business Association of Jamaica. Dr. Dana Morris Dixon, Economist, Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer, Jamaica National Group. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The Jamaica National Group has given our support and is pleased to be associated with this Caribbean Policy Research Institute Budget Forum. Emerging from the Jamaica National Building Society, our group of companies has maintained its focus to serve the financial and other needs of Jamaicans for more than 14 decades. In this regard, CAPRI is also in the business of servicing the needs of the Jamaican people. In its case, through invaluable and incisive research in the areas of social and economic issues. We therefore support the value of what CAPRI does, recognizing the alignment of our respective missions. The subject of this evening's discussion, winners and losers in the 2019-2020 budget, has been the subject of analysis by several different persons and groups. Different and contrasting perspectives have also been shared. The supporters of the budget opine that it is a substantial stimulus package which provides targeted benefits to the poor, while focusing on reductions in taxes which are perceived to be a nuisance and impediment to growth, particularly for the MSME sector. The converse view has been that it is a tight budget with very modest increases, which gives little to the poor and shows little appreciation for what it takes to promote economic growth. Although I'm a chartered accountant and financial consultant, I started out many years ago as a student in the Department of Economics, trying to come to grips with issues of economic growth in small island states. And my career passion has flowed into the areas of financial empowerment and entrepreneurship. I therefore personally find this debate about economic policy alternatives to be of profound importance to the future development of our beloved Jamaica. In this regard, CAPRI has demonstrated its capacity to provide clarity and guidance in cutting through thickets of apparent contradictions on major national policy issues. And as a widely diversified services conglomerate, we at the Jamaica National Group have a vital corporate interest in maintaining clarity and focus on what it will take for Jamaica to be the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. I therefore look forward to the results of this evening's discussion. On behalf of our JN Group CEO, the Honorable Earl Jarrett, I close by reiterating our support for the social and economic analysis which CAPRI has produced in the past, and we pledge to continue our links with CAPRI to enable the continuation of such work into the future. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to this budget analysis, annual budget review by CAPRI. My name is Emily Shields, and I'm going to be your moderator for the evening. Beautiful theme: path, police, and patty shops. Ours are really well run nowadays, so it's not at all an embarrassment for patty shops to be up there. It's going to be interesting this evening because we have this very interactive platform called Slido, and I'm going to ask you to take out your instruments because I know you all have your cell phones. And what I want you to do is to, let's go to the slide. Let's go to the slide and we'll tell you what to do from here. Connect to the Wi-Fi. When you connect to Wi-Fi, do that by getting to username policy, password policy. You're not supposed to can do it faster because it's cell phone age we are in. Yeah? Policy, username and password. Open your browser and go to sli.do, as is at number 1 there. And you're going to enter the event code, #CAPRI. Why we do this is because we want you to put your questions on this platform we want you to also put your name there so that we can have people in the audience vote on the question they most want answered, and we will ask the person in the audience who's posted that question to have your question answered in the very short time that we have. Right? Do you all have that now? The instructions are going to be up, so you can make sure that you're logged on to get your questions up. In the meantime, as you sort that out, please help me introduce at this time the Executive Director of CAPRI, Dr. Damian King, who will give his overview, his findings of the budget for this year. Dr. Damian King.
Thank you, Emily. Honorable Minister, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Jamaica has the privilege of having made significant achievements in its history. There was a time, some of you here will remember, decades ago, when elections in Jamaica were known for violence and lack of trust and credibility. Today, Jamaica has a world-class electoral system in terms of trust, in terms of competence, to the point where they are very often called upon to play a role in elections around the world. It's something where we have come from having a poor record to having an enviable record. It seems that we may be in the midst of a transformation of similar magnitude. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start by looking at the big picture into which this particular budget has to fit. Since the turn of the century, our fiscal management has been characterized by large fiscal deficits, which essentially means that year after year after year, our governments have spent more than they have taken in revenue. All of this contributing to, and while being one of the most indebted countries in the world. Now, it does not take a huge grasp of arithmetic to realize that if you're already indebted and you keep having to borrow more, that debt will never go away and it's unsustainable. Then starting with the budget of 2012-2013, something quite remarkable happened. Jamaica started balancing its budgets. Within the margin of omissions and definitions, we have had roughly balanced budgets for the last 6 years, roughly balanced accounts. And the new budget promulgated by the Honorable Minister continues that achievement. As a result of this discovery of the importance of and the capacity for fiscal management, our debt expressed as a percentage of GDP, which used to be nearly 150%, that is 1.5 times the value of our total annual production, has steadily declined to the point where at the end of this fiscal year, this month, the debt is now, for the first time, less than 100% of GDP, and programmed to continue going down. It is hard to overemphasize the scale of this achievement. When you look back at the recent history of highly indebted countries, you cannot find a single country that had debt that is as high as 150% of GDP anywhere in the world that has managed to bring it down to less than 100% without debt relief. It is a unique and singular achievement of this country. This is the context in which this budget is being promulgated. This opens up what we call space, fiscal space. Because the problem with debt is that servicing that debt takes resources away from investing in the capacity to grow and from providing public services like health and education. The improved fiscal management and the reduction in the debt creates fiscal space in two ways. First, the cost of interest falls. Whereas interest payments used to occupy close to half of tax revenue in one particular year, 40% in many years, it has now come down to only a fifth of government revenue. The second way in which fiscal space is opened up, the ability to use resources to provide the services for which government is supposed to, is that better fiscal management and increased compliance increases the amount of tax revenue. Tax revenue has gone up by over $100 billion. And this is inflation-adjusted terms. That is, like all the numbers in this presentation, looking at presenting numbers for the previous years, inflating them to compensate for the fact that things now cost more. So this is in purchasing power terms. Tax revenue has been rising impressively. The first thing you want to know about a budget is whether that budget is responsible in the sense that it is consistent with continued debt reduction. And fall in interest payments and rising revenue and the projected continued fall in the public debt assures us that the budget that is promulgated by Minister Clark is consistent with continued debt reduction. That the tax reductions that were announced are not to be interpreted as some kind of giveaway, an abandonment of fiscal responsibility. In the context of a balanced budget, this is a responsible budget. In terms of where the country needs to go, you might say that we are on, well, you know. So let us go now beneath that to look at some of the important trends and changes that we all care about. We can divide what a government does with its resources into four grand categories: general administration, security, social services, and the economy. The proposed expenditure budget is divided amongst those four broad categories according to the amounts you see in billions of dollars. We start off with this because it tells us the choice that we face. That if we are going to have a debate, which in fact is the debate that we're going to have here, in terms of which area of government's responsibility needs more resources, then that debate has to take place in the context of recognizing that it means less resources for one of these other areas. Now that we have more fiscal space, the question that we need to address as a society and transmit that to the policymakers as well as we can is, how do we use that fiscal space? How is it being used? And do we agree with that? And do we want a different direction? let us see what we can get out of the current budget proposed in terms of those choices. First, the allocation to security. Well, we start with this because this is where we see the most significant increase in resources. Again, these expenditures from past budgets is in purchasing power terms. So we are comparing like with like. And we see that compared to the fiscal year now ending, the new budget proposes a 26% increase in the allocation to security. We can conclude from this, without going any further, that the government's big priority is managing crime and violence. That is its big priority at this point. If we look at how the allocation to social services has changed, bearing in mind from the pie chart that we saw at the beginning, that social services is already the largest share of the budget. In that context, we see that there were increases in the allocation to social services between 2015 and 2017, and thereafter, it has essentially treaded water. So the new budget proposes an allocation, inflation adjusted, which is very close to what has been spent in the fiscal year now ending. And the third major draw on public resources is the economy. It is promoting commerce and economic growth. We see here that there were significant increases 3 and 4 years ago, and it has been more or less steady since then. In real terms, there was increased allocation of about 4%. So these are the choices that the government has made compared to the current fiscal year. Looking at those same choices, but putting it in a slightly longer term context, we have gone back to the first fiscal accounts of the present government and added up the increased allocations over the last 3 years to see, out of those 3 categories, where has the additional resources gone. And we see that most of it has gone to security and economic growth, has gone to crime and violence and promoting commerce and economic growth, with a smaller share of it going to social services. So I think we can take away from this what the government's priorities have been in recent years and where it is going. The last thing that we need to do is to see what the budget tells us about where the economy is going to go. What can we see looking forward? And there are 2 areas that we need to call attention to. The first one is the government's allocation to capital expenditure. One of the big problems with not having the fiscal space that we had in the past was that there was never enough attention to infrastructure. The roads got worse. There was never enough attention to infrastructure because every time it came nearer to the end of the fiscal year and things got tight, they would always pull from the capital expenditure budget. And so we kept underinvesting in the basic capacity of the economy to produce. As fiscal space opened up, we see that there has been a massive increase in the allocation of public investment. In comparable purchasing power terms, 4 years ago, it was less than $40 billion. For the current year and the coming fiscal year, it is proposed to be $72 billion. So that suggests a real focus in the budget on economic growth. The second forward-looking change that we have seen in fiscal management is the signature announcement of the reduction in the transfer taxes, both the tax on transferring property and the stamp duty. That's an accumulated tax before the change of 9% of the value of the property, which for most transactions now is going to come down to an accumulated approximately 2%. So that's a 7 percentage point reduction in the cost of transferring property. So we did some research. The purpose of this research was to see what effect this is going to have on the economy. The first thing to do is to correct the notion that this is a fiscal stimulus. A stimulus is simply when a government spends more than it takes in because it's trying to give consumers spending power. It's not a very intelligent way to stimulate the economy because, as we saw from the very first chart, we had been doing that for a dozen years and the economy got stimulated to nowhere. And indeed, since this is a balanced budget, indeed there's a small surplus that is projected, it is not stimulating anything. That is not the purpose of the cut in the transfer tax. The purpose of the cut in the transfer tax is to make the economy more efficient. It is to reduce an obstacle to investment. So we looked at the academic literature to try to see what is the effect, what is the cost of this obstacle to investment. And we actually found a handful of papers that address the issue. Two which were particularly clear in their empirical estimation. One looked at the case of Canada, another one from France. And they were able to estimate the consequences of changes in the transfer tax. One caution is that both of them were looking at the effect of increases in the transfer tax. And in both cases, the effect was actually quite modest. In the case of Canada, it was an approximately 1% increase in the transfer tax. In the case of France, it was an increase in the transfer tax of 0.7%. Our reduction of 7 percentage points is on a different scale entirely. But the results were interesting nonetheless. The first result is that the value of property rises or changes commensurately with the size of the change in the tax. So a 1% change in the transfer tax, a 1% increase in the transfer tax reduces property values by 1%. A 7% reduction in the transfer tax should increase property values by 7%. That's a pretty good deal for property owners. And in the context of a country with large historical inequalities in wealth, much of which is based on ownership of property, it's something for us to bear in mind as we go forward. But the purpose of the tax reduction is to stimulate investment. And both papers resulted significant effects on the volume of transactions and potentially, therefore, the amount of investment. The smallest estimate the smaller of the estimates out of the two papers suggests that the volume of transactions increases by 10 times the change in the transfer tax. Now, we can't extrapolate to Jamaica quite simply because, as I said, they were looking at small changes, a 1% change in the transfer tax, which resulted, in the case of Canada, with a 10% change in investment. But the point here is that a 7% reduction in the transfer tax, both of them taken together, is likely to have an increase in the volume of investment because there's no investment that doesn't require a transfer of property, by a multiple of that. So this has the potential to remove, according to the empirical evidence, a major obstacle to investment. So we take away from this. We put the spotlight on 3 conclusions I would suggest from this budget. First, the budget continues Jamaica's new tradition of proper fiscal management with positive long-term consequences in terms of debt reduction. There was no giveaway. Whatever political advantages were gained by promoting it as a giveaway, there was no giveaway. Secondly, the priorities in the budget are dealing with crime and violence and promoting economic growth. And finally, the reduction in the transfer tax looks as if it's going to remove a major obstacle to investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. And I can't believe after such an eye-opening presentation, it's such a lousy round of applause you give. Wow. So, when the Gleaner called the minister Santa Clark, looks like we're going to have to take that back. Tomorrow's headline should read Santa Clark minus or something else, because Dr. Damien King says there was no giveaway in the budget. It's not a stimulus. So forget about the stimulus. And importantly as well, and the figures don't lie, what he said is the social services, when he's compared the allocation since 2015, when we adjust this year's for inflation, it is the same as last year. 1% a bit less this year, and 1% is nothing in money terms. But very interesting, and this is why we applaud the work that CAPRI does all of these years to bring intelligent analysis to what can be complicated matters for some, but obviously simplified and made publicly palatable for all. So a round of applause for CAPRI, please. We're streaming live on Twitter and also on CAPRI's website, which is capricaribbean.org. And don't forget to send your questions to Slido. Make sure you sign up in the way I told you. Whilst we welcome at this time, they called him firstly Black Royalty, and then he promised carpet, and we got some chaos with the carpet, especially this evening, but teething pains, and the Gleaner called him Santa Clark, a myth that has been debunked by Dr. Damien King. So we now welcome formally and officially the Finance Minister, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, for his 15 minutes presentation.
Thank you. Oh, I don't have to go to the mic. Thank you, Emily. I was about to say that Jamaica is the only country in the world where Christmas comes in March. Ho, ho. Today, just wanted to add some remarks on the budget presentation. I have spoken extensively on the budget in Parliament and outside of Parliament, so today's presentation is going to be slightly different, not necessarily repeating a lot of the things that have been said earlier in my earlier presentations, even though some will be repeated, but trying to provide the larger context in which the budget unfolds, and maybe responding to a couple of comments that Damien mentioned. You know, it's helpful when you have a discussion to always consider the historical context. And Damien showed some of this earlier. Unfortunately, you can't read the bottom. The red represents the fiscal balance that you saw earlier. The blue, the primary balance, and the black line, the debt. And the story this tells is that we've essentially had a long period of fiscal laxity, even though the central government was maintaining high primary surpluses, which is the tragedy of it. It's not as if we were benefiting necessarily from the fiscal laxity. It was all going in interest, essentially. It wasn't as if the government was spending so much money on social services or building and we're running, not that kind of recklessness, but a recklessness almost without purpose, right? So you're having this high primary, which is constraining everything, and at the same time, you have these runaway deficits that's building the debt. The historical backdrop as well has to consider the fact that Jamaica's conditions are very rigid, right? There's no budget that can do everything. And within a particular budget, there are, before you get to April 1st of each year, most of your expenditure is already accounted for in the form of wages and salaries and interest. Those are fixed. You can't change those in any quick. And we're coming from a time period, I don't know how well you can actually see it, where wages and compensation and interest were greater than tax revenues. Back in 2003, 2004, and all the way up to 2010, it actually peaked there. It was 120% of tax revenues. And what we've seen over the last several years with our economic reform program is that that has been coming down, and in this year's budget, compensation and interest as a percentage of tax revenues is all the way down to about much less than the figures here. I think the percentage would be just under 60%. So we've made a lot of progress. But that is where we're coming from, that kind of rigidity. Now, when you look at the composition of budgetary expenditure, and here we have it over the last 6 years, the blue represents compensation, and here I'm looking at compensation, not just wages and salaries as you see them in the budget, but wages and salaries with some of the allowance categories that are actually in programs. And red represents interest, green represents pension, purple, CAPEX, and the aqua blue represents other. And what you can see here as well, I'm just trying to point out the rigidity in budgetary expenditures, that when you account for interest and compensation, you've accounted for a lot. And then when you add to that pensions, which are growing as a percentage, pensions today are about $38 billion. 5 years ago, it was about $23 billion. All right, so it's growing at a rapid clip. It just means that the wiggle room that exists is not as large as we'd want it to be to deal with all of the needs of society. So we have to prioritize. Every government has to establish priorities that responds to the people. Now, all of this occurs in a context where Jamaica historically, hopefully we have gone down a little bit, we have improved in this arena, but has historically had the highest tax revenues as a percentage of GDP in the Caribbean. And here we're considering tax revenues and adding the fees charged by public bodies. And this chart is sourced of the IMF, courtesy of the fund. And you can see that in red, we stand out among our sister countries in the Caribbean region as having the highest sort of tax burden. Now, when you add to that, if you look at central government expenditure and you look at public body expenditure, and you say, how much does that represent as a size of the economy? Central government expenditure and public body expenditure together is about 50% represents about 50% of GDP, which is extremely large. And that imposes a burden, shall we say, on the economy, or an inability for the economy to demonstrate the kind of dynamism that we want it to show. And again, this is just for perspective and background. Now, here I'm showing the original budget for last year. I'm showing the first and second supplementary, and the budget for 2019-20. And there's a lot of numbers to digest. But what I want to point to here that no one has necessarily pointed to is the fact that, yes, we have had tax revenues increasing, but if you look at non-tax revenue year over year, you'll see that in the year that is finishing, that's concluding, we had non-tax revenues of approximately $74 billion. And the non-tax revenue that we have programmed for next year drops to $59 billion. Okay? That is a significant drop in the context of Jamaica's finances of about $14 billion. That represents the difference between the dividends that we received from public bodies this year and what we expect to receive next year. And we got a dividend from Petrocarib in this financial year of about $20 billion, which enabled us to do a lot of the, some of the capital works that we were able to complete this year, and we don't have it next year. Okay, so everything else has been made up by tax revenues. And that is important to consider when you think about what we have to work with in the year coming vis-a-vis the year that has just concluded. Now, with all of that said, with all the rigidity that we have described, with I want you to bear that in mind as I show the charts that follow, because the charts that follow represent prioritization in action. And where do those priorities come from? Those priorities come from you, the people. Every poll that is conducted in Jamaica in the last few years has shown that the biggest concern of Jamaicans is security. The second biggest concern of Jamaicans is jobs and the economy. That wasn't something that I said. That is demonstrated in every single poll over the last several years. So a government that is responsive to the people has to represent the people's concerns in how a budget is crafted. If the people's concerns, as demonstrated by how they respond to questions like these, were different, the budget would reflect those concerns. So it is so in that context that I described of over the last 5 years in inflation-adjusted terms. So here I'm using an analysis that's similar to what Damien used, which is to look at the nominal figures for capital expenditure and to inflate the historical figures by the inflation that has occurred over that time so we can compare like with like. And on a like-for-like comparison, CapEx has gone up by 162% between 2019-20 and 2014-15. Now, CapEx is the expenditure item that can really change our circumstances. Okay? And by capital expenditure here, we mean those items of expenditure that come through the public investment management process, where a public investment management project is undertaken, and it is essentially a one-off, it's non-repeatable, and it is implemented. And this is how everything that you associate with being able to change our circumstances comes through the capital expenditure line item. And one way to think about the fiscal rehabilitation that we have undertaken, it has been a fiscal rehabilitation that has been geared towards opening up space for us to increase our capital expenditure. Because it is through capital expenditure that we can procure security equipment, which is necessary for it to deliver on the security desires of the country. Police stations and fire stations, courthouses, computer hardware and networking across government, computer software, social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, highways, roads, bridges, public parks, cultural and entertainment venues, etc., etc., etc. Garbage trucks, right? Quality of life is greatly or improvements in quality of life is greatly correlated with our ability to increase capital expenditure, which is why it has been such a focus of the government. Now, just to put it in context, that we have only just begun. We are coming from, you know, a place not too long ago where we would sacrifice other expenditure. Sorry, we would sacrifice capital expenditure for other expenditure that only affects today. CapEx, when you spend it today, you have the effect over a long period of time. But even though we have been able to make that headway, CapEx as a percentage of GDP, and this graph is courtesy of the fund as well, and I think it's from about 2017, CapEx as a percentage of GDP is still low relative to our peers, i.e. there's a lot more that we want to be able to do. But in the context of the rigidity that I showed you earlier, right, the only way in which we're going to increase that purple as a percentage is going to be through further growth in the economy and therefore delivering further fiscal space. So improvement in quality of life largely derives through our ability to engage in capital expenditure for physical and social infrastructure. That's exactly what we're doing, but we want to do a lot more. Now, one of the largest components of budgetary expenditure is public sector compensation. Now, public sector compensation is, you know, ministers are paid from public sector compensation, parliamentarians, everybody, teachers, doctors, nurses, policemen, firemen, and all the people who work in the civil service. As a total, it is the largest share, largest single item of expenditure in the budget, apart from debt service, if you add principal payments and interest payments. And on an inflation-adjusted basis, and here in compensation, I'm including the allowances in programs. So this year, it's about just over $230 billion on compensation, which in the context of spending approximately $570 billion, it's about 40% of government expenditure overall. And it has increased steadily in inflation-adjusted terms. And accounts, as I said, that increase accounts for a large share of the increase in expenditure over the time period that we're looking at. When you consider public sector pensions, which I mentioned to you earlier, $38 billion in this budget, this is in inflation-adjusted terms, a 22% increase on where it was in 2014-15. So here I'm just sort of pointing out, in inflation-adjusted terms, where allocations occur, and a lot of them occur in areas that are fixed, that we don't have, they're rigid. You can't just get up one morning and decide that you're going to change that allocation. Now, Damon mentioned something about social. And I think he was putting together a whole category of items, which when lumped together is about $200 billion and in health and education and other areas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the position that we are in, when we are so rigid, our accounts are so rigid, a government has to prioritize, and those priorities have to reflect the interest of the people. And the interest, as established by many public surveys, security and jobs and the economy. Within that prioritization, though, even though those are established as priorities, protection of the vulnerable is another priority of the government. And over the past 5 years, on an inflation-adjusted basis, the second largest sort of increase in terms of percentage terms, apart from CapEx, has been to social programs, which between 2019-2020 and 2014-15, in inflation-adjusted terms, have increased by more than 70%. In nominal terms, it has more than doubled. So I want that to be absolutely clear. Within the category of what he describes as social, if you go to social programs directed at the poor and vulnerable, that has been a priority of the government. And you see the increase between 1920 and 1819 is a very significant one. That alone is more than 25%. But then when you measure it with 14-15, it's 60%. A lot of our gains have gone in that direction. Now, what is included in this? Included in this is all the expenditure for PATH, for all the families who are on PATH, for PATH school feeding, for PATH transportation, meaning kids on PATH getting food on a daily basis when they go to school, PATH transportation, children being provided with transportation to make sure they attend school, examination support for kids on PATH to make sure that they have the funds to be able to pay for CSEC and CAPE examinations, and so forth. It also includes social expenditure across ministries, including for the first time, well, not first time, but we added 2 shelters for victims of domestic abuse. We had 1 before. We've increased it by 200%. We'll now have 3. So each county will have 1. It also includes expenditure on sanitation and on poverty reduction and social and economic support for the most vulnerable communities, from the Office of the Prime Minister through the Citizen Justice and Security Program and in other ministries as well. And this has been, again, when you have rigidity, you have to establish firm priorities. And by evidence of what I've presented here, this has been a firm priority of the government. Now, as far as the revenue measures are concerned, and there's been a lot of attention focused on revenue measures, just a few points to bear in mind that over 95% of all companies in Jamaica are MSMEs. And the private sector accounts for over 90% of employment in Jamaica. 1.25 million people employed, only 115,000, 120,000 employed in the public sector, central government and public bodies. The MSMEs account for over 90% of all private sector employment. Therefore, if you want economic vitality, you have to be concerned with the vibrancy and vitality of small and medium-sized businesses. And hence, that has been a focus of the budget. With the reduction or the abolishment in the minimum business tax, the abolishment in the asset tax, and the raising of the GCT threshold. Other thing to bear in mind in revenue measures, 1.25 million people employed, 70% of property transactions in 2018 could be completed with 2 NHT mortgages across Jamaica, because a lot of the property transactions are for lots in subdivisions and so forth. And that's what the data suggests. In parishes like St. Thomas and Clarendon and St. Elizabeth, 90% of them could be completed with 2 NHT mortgages. So, and there is a significant unfulfilled demand for housing at the lower end. Significant. When the government came to market 2 years ago with 1,500 housing solutions priced at $5 million in St. James, there are 11,000 applications. Now, what we want to do is but when you're selling a house for $5 million in the private end of the market, and you're going to have transaction taxes of 9%, on a $5 million home or a $6 million home, it creates great disincentives, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And the transaction cost as a percentage of the person's income is much greater on the lower end of the market than it is on the higher end of the market. So if we are going to try and solve this bottleneck that exists, the government has to sort of get out of the way, and allow transactions to take place without trying to take a lion's share out of it. So the measure is intended to stimulate supply of housing solutions. There will be many more people who will go into the business of supplying, and in particular, we want to incentivize supply at the lower end of the market and remove barriers to home acquisition. So I will have a chance to respond to any questions during the question and answer, but I just wanted to present that overall context before we get into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. A lot to reconcile this evening. Happy about the Minister's presentation juxtaposed with Dr. Damian King's. So let's now welcome our panelists. And this is where we ask you to get your questions all lined up because we want you to pose those very hard questions to the Minister and to Dr. King. Welcome the panelists. The first panelist, the Minister, the Honorable Nigel Clark. Dr. Damian King, Executive Director of CAPRI. And Dr. Dana Morris Dixon, Assistant General Manager of JN Group. Remember, get on to Slido for me while they get settled. So for Slido, you're to connect to the Wi-Fi. The username is policy. The password is also policy. Open your browser and go to sli.do. Enter the code #CAPRI. And you're going to put your questions there. We have a lot of questions and we're going to take them soon. Now for this panel discussion, I'm going to ask Dr. Dana Morris Dixon to begin giving her 3-minute perspective. Yeah? And then I want you to start asking questions because you've heard the Minister, you've heard Dr. King. Keep your questions very short, to the point, and let them answer. Don't give me 2 questions at a time, 1 at a time, please. Here's Dr. Dana Morris Dixon.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I was told I was given 5 minutes to talk about my reactions to the budget presentation. And I have to start by noting, you know, when we had our first IMF program, I was in the public sector. And we didn't do so well with it. I mean, then we had another one. And I remember looking at that IMF program and saying, there's no way that Jamaica can do this, especially given some of the conditions that were there. And how comfortable, but I'm very big on narratives and the narratives that we say about ourselves as a people. It also shows the maturity of our political system too, because this spans administrations and ministers, from Peter Phillips to Audley Shaw to our esteemed minister who's on the panel here. It involved the social partnership. It involved a lot of public servants across the country. This was really very much a national initiative to get us to this type of macroeconomic stability that we can all be so proud of. And so I commend the minister for continuing on that track. And I think when we look at this budget, it has significant psychological impact. As the minister said, we don't have a lot of room to do fancy things. I mean, we all want to spend more on education, on healthcare, on everything, but we have to do it within a context. All of us have our own home budgets. You have to make priorities. We all want the nice car, the house, the everything, but you have to prioritize, and that's the same thing here. And from a business standpoint, a lot of the things that the minister spoke about in terms of the small business sector, those are precisely the kinds of things that we need to see to stimulate that sector. So I've said a lot of nice things, but of course, you know, when you say the nice things, you have to follow it with a but or a however. So, however, let's be very frank about where we are as a people. In 1970, our GDP per capita was about 4,500 in real terms. In 2017, we're at 4,800. We barely moved. So we've not gotten any richer as a country, as a people. And I know it's a concern that we all have. And we tend to want to see our governments doing so much. But, you know, many of us look at, you know, what's the right role for the government to play in our economy. And I think that what we've been seeing quite a bit of is this notion that, you know, if we get macroeconomic stability, then growth will come. And that's possible, but we've not necessarily seen it in this case. The budget does tell us what the priorities are of the government, and it was very clear: national security, capital expenditure. But added to that, was the emphasis on small business. And I think we cannot forget about that piece, the small businesses and what has been projected in relation to that. And the housing piece, it's a very important part of the budget presentation, and I think it's very important. But macroeconomic stability, while it's important, is not the sufficient condition for it. And even if we think macroeconomic stability will lead to growth, it would start with an assumption that markets are efficient. And we know there's a lot of friction in our markets. Ask any small business operator about bureaucracy in our country. And they will tell you how difficult it is to do business. And so as we do this conversation, have this conversation about what's the right role of the government in stimulating the economy, in a context where there's not much space to do a lot of stimulation, we have to look at how can the government's policies really set the groundwork for the future that we want. And so I say to you that the business environment, which everybody's looking at their business environment, some years we're up, some years we're down in terms of the doing business report, but that has to be a priority of the government if we are really serious about stimulating investments in our country. In addition to that, there is that capital and how do you get people who have great ideas to access capital? And we've seen interest rates coming down across the banking sector and the financial sector generally, and that is absolutely important, seeing those lower interest rates. But that has to be coupled with other things. And the last thing I'll say, before I go any further, we're always talking about Singapore and how Singapore was just like us in 1960, and then look at Singapore. But I really believe that we also have to look at growth a lot and have a radical growth impetus. So we've been talking about macroeconomic stability, but not really talking about growth as much. What do we want Jamaica to look like in 10 years? What are those sectors? You hear about the logistics hub, you hear about BPO. Those are important sectors, but we have to have an integrated growth strategy that looks at how our education system links back into that and how our bureaucratic systems also support those industries. So I will stop there, Emily, but just noting that yes, we're on the right path, but we have to have a conversation about how we're going to get Jamaica from 4,000 something in GDP per capita.
Thank you for kickstarting the discussion in that way. If you have a question, I want you to put your hand up and one of the ushers will come to you so we get it flowing smoothly. Those who've posted a question on Slido, Hugh Reid, put your hand up for me so we'll come to you in just a moment. I need to have this issue reconciled, Minister, Dr. King. And I'd like to take full notes. Dr. King, based on your chart, you said social services for this fiscal year, including education, health, and welfare, those that accounted for 216 billion. When you did your numbers, you said, based on the allocation from 2015, when you've adjusted this year's for inflation, the allocation to social services is just about the same as it was last year. In fact, a negligible 1% reduction. Dr. Clark gave a presentation on the said social services, and he said, over the last 5 years, it is the second largest increase that we have in social services. 60% it is of the government's overall allocation, and in nominal terms, it's more than doubled last year, and they say figures don't tell untruth. How do you reconcile that, Dr. King? Do you agree with his math and his calculation? Or if not, please explain the major discrepancy.
Yes, because I was addressing a much larger category called social services. The vast majority of that is the educational system and the health services, which take up a lot of non-discretionary money. A much smaller portion of that is the allocation to social programs.
Yes.
And it is the allocation to social programs where Minister Clark can take over and talk about what they have done in that particular narrow category, which is what you addressed.
Correct. So, well, just in What I heard Damien say is that in the broad category, when he was looking at the functional allocation to those categories that he mentioned, which totals about $200 billion, that vis-a-vis 2015, there was a big increase up to 2017, but from 2017-18, 2018-19 it remained flat, and to 19-20 in inflation-adjusted terms. So nominal terms, there are increases, clearly, but inflation-adjusted terms. Where the focus of the government has been, as far as that is concerned, is on the poor and vulnerable. And that is a component within this big envelope. And so you have priorities within priorities. And though something may nominally appear to be flat, you have to look much deeper than that to see what is really happening. And we have increased spending on social programs for the vulnerable across a range of ministries by 100% in nominal terms and by 60% in inflation-adjusted terms, as I outlined.
Thank you, Minister. Yeah. Thank you. Man in the green shirt, work with me. Thank you. Hugh Reid has a question on Slido, and we'll have him ask the question that he's put up. Yeah?
The question is...
Just a moment. Just make sure that this is working. And thank you for joining us on Twitter and on CAPRI Caribbean. Yes, Mr. Reid.
Yes, the question arises from Dr. King's presentation in which he spoke about...
All right, we're trying to get the mic so that those watching and listening can hear that properly.
The question?
Thank you.
Okay. The question arises from Dr. King's presentation in which he spoke about the reduction in transfer taxes translating into economic efficiency. And I wanted to know what could be some of the factors that would prevent that translation into economic efficiency, and what can we do as a country about them?
Thank you, Mr. Reid.
Well, it's interesting how you pose that question, because perhaps we want to address it in reverse. The thrust of what I had indicated is the context for the budget is the improvement in fiscal stability that we have experienced, coupled with improvements in monetary policy as well, where we now have low single-digit inflation. We've had it now for almost 5 years, as compared to average inflation rates of 10, 12%, going back for the last 20 years before that. Improvements as well in the ease of starting a business. So the question is, in the context of these other growth-promoting changes, the transfer tax might have been one of the obstacles that preventing all of those from coming to fruition. So I saw it in terms of we sort of did the other things first, or many of the other things first. And now we're removing what could be one of the remaining obstacles, but perhaps there are others.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. We have a couple questions Dr. King, we have a couple questions from the floor. I will just get the mic around to them in just a moment. In the meantime, Minister, Dr. King said there's likely to be a volume of investment, and there's a potential for the reduction in transfer tax and stamp duty to remove a major obstacle to investment, and he considered Canada and France. Did you have a look at any of those studies when you had these reductions?
Well, Canada and France, are developed economies, and so the way in which things is different from Jamaica, which is a developing country. We would have looked at, or I would have looked at, Emily, transfer and stamp duties in many countries across the world, and seeing what other countries have done. In Barbados, transfer tax has been 2% for the last 20 or 30 years, and they had a booming economy until they made some bad decisions a couple of years ago. New Zealand abolished transfer tax and stamp duties on properties several years ago. Estonia has reduced stamp duties. And these are all small countries who have sought to stimulate domestic activity by doing that. And that was something that we looked at. we speak about the impact of this in terms of people being able to purchase houses, but don't forget the spill-on effect, right, of carpenters and masons and electricians and people who supply furniture and supply fittings to homes. We believe that if transaction activity increases and the supply of homes increase, then people who are in that supply chain, artisans and those who provide products and services, will also benefit from the increased volume.
All right, thank you so much. Let me come to a question over here, and then I'm going to come to Dr. Dana on the platform there. Yes, sir, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and the panel especially. My name is Dwayne Little. I'm an educator. The question that I have is to piggyback on Dr. Dixon's comment about the vision of growth. One of the things that I'm looking at is going forward with regards to the service corps, which I think is a really good idea. How can we match the service corps with a sort of volunteer registry? Because obviously we're not getting enough businesses growing or coming in to pull in these persons to get employed. But if we can put them through, after they get that core training, be a part of various sort of volunteer things in areas that they're interested in or they have an aptitude in, I think that's an area that we could match with the service corps. Additionally to that,
what's the question?
No, man, I get into the question.
Yes, you have to get there.
No, I get in. Is there any? So the question is there any attempt at matching the service corps recruits with a volunteer registry, as well as including on that financial literacy?
Good question, thank you.
So I absolutely agree with that. The Service Corps is a fantastic program that's doing amazing things in the lives of young people across Jamaica. One of the things that it does is to prepare young Jamaicans for the workforce. People who leave that Service Corps training are prepared for all the elements of working. They have the emotional preparation, they have the physical preparation, and they have the discipline. The Service Corps program includes financial literacy. They get a stipend during the program, and they're taught budgeting and the basic skills of expenditure management and saving. And so they leave the program with a pool of savings. And while they're in the program, remember, they're working. Some of them are doing digitization of records and doing various jobs. The intention, yes, is to ensure that there is a marketplace where they can be matched with opportunities. For the time being, since it has been started, a lot of them have been absorbed into the security forces. Some of them into the JDF, others into the police, others into the correctional services. I imagine when the program runs for a few years, and into private security companies. When the program runs for a few years, those avenues will be exhausted, and we'll have to have the circle of employable opportunities expand with the growth in the program.
Dr. Dana Morris-Dixon, you have a point?
I had wanted to add on the transfer tax and stamp duty, just because, you know, our organization started in 1874, and it was around giving people an opportunity, Jamaicans, black, recently freed slaves, who couldn't access financial services, an opportunity to own their own home. This transfer tax and stamp duty reduction is a very significant one. We are, when we talk to a lot of young professionals, and I'm pitching this to the young professionals, a lot of them talk about their inability to own a home. When you talk to UE students and UE graduates, they're saying they're leaving Jamaica because they don't see many prospects. And an important part of that is the ability to own a home. And we've seen many instances where individuals are working out how much mortgage am I going to pay for this particular value, and forgetting that there is this huge cost related to stamp duty and transfer tax. And it often sometimes delays the transactions going forward because you thought you had your down payment, but you also have these taxes to pay. This is actually very significant when we're talking about giving people an opportunity to own a home. So that's very important. And I think the point on financial literacy is exceptionally important, because that is an area where we find that it's one of the reasons that there is not enough financial inclusion because people don't understand basic finances. And so I think what CAPRI is doing in breaking down the budget to English so that people can understand it and understand the context around which these decisions occur and can also put it in place in their own lives is very important.
Thank you so much. Sue, who has a question on Slido, please put your hand up. In the meantime, Anonymous has a question on Slido. Dr. Nigel Clark.
Anonymous, that's a dangerous one. How I know it's directed to me? How I know?
Well, this is the question, Minister. Dr. Nigel Clark, please put your phones on silent. It's a very important session, this. Dr. Nigel Clark, external demands, that's the diaspora and FDIs, are driving house prices above the average domestic consumer's budget. How do you propose to curtail this?
Okay.
Very good question, Anonymous.
Sure. So I want to say just two things. Piggybacking on what Dr. Dixon just mentioned and responding to the question. When you think of a home, a starter home, affordable home that costs $6 million, right? That, or $5 million. That, what? Jamaican dollars?
Where?
No.
Where, Minister? That is for the kitchen.
Allow me to continue. I was the chairman of the NHT, and I'm speaking about housing solutions that the NHT has brought to the market when I was chairman a year ago. I'm just making an example. Just allow me for. We had, as I mentioned earlier, 1,500 homes for sale in St. James that cost $5 million, and we got 11,000 applications. The only point I want to make, and we can come to prices in a second, in relation to that, is that a $5 million home or a $6 million home can be purchased on a salary of $12,000 a week, given the products that NHT has. Right? On $12,000 a week, the person can qualify for a 0% mortgage, and now at $15,000 a week, you can get a 0% mortgage, and at $5 million, 100% financing, it would cost just about 33% of income, which is what?
Minister, I don't want to break your stride, but we listened to the budget, and we heard those arguments. What Anonymous is asking, particularly with the context of the demand outstripping the supply, which is what your example pointed to.
This is what I'm getting to, Emily. Allow me.
Okay,
allow me.
So
from then, I was seized. When I saw that as chairman of the NHT, right? I was chairman of the NHT when those houses went to market. And I saw the overwhelming demand. And then we started to put ads out to say, look, we have pieces of land here. We have the customers. We have the funding. We just want developers to develop homes that cost that price.
Yes.
And we could not attract developers. Why? Because so much of the price goes into transaction costs that for a developer that's non-government, it is not attractive. By removing the transaction taxes, what we want and what will happen is that we'll see more developers stepping into the market at all elements of the spectrum. Now, with respect to the question of that Anonymous asked about diaspora crowding out, the challenge is not so much diaspora crowding out, Emily. The challenge that we have had in Jamaica is a concentration of private sector developers focusing, if this is the market here, they're focusing on this part of the market. They're not focusing here. You understand? And government policy has to be geared towards, if you go to the Dominican Republic, I have been to the DomRep and I have visited many developers who focus on this end of the market. Right? And we have, in the NHT review that I was chairman of, we identified what's described as a market failure. And Damien was on it, by chance, or by coincidence. A market failure in that here we have a lot of demand, especially with interest rates where they are and what NHT does. Rental what you pay in monthly rent can equate what you pay in a mortgage.
Right.
But we have two obstacles. Let me just finish. Two obstacles have been large transaction taxes. That has been one obstacle. And the second obstacle has been limited supply of houses at that price point.
Right.
We are addressing the transaction taxes by reducing them or obliterating them. And the thing that we have to address is the supply. But that's what government policy is focused on.
Let me just add one point,
Dr. King.
that the transaction taxes in the particular instance where that minister is talking about hits the market twice, because the developer has to acquire the land for the development. He pays the transfer tax and has to put that onto his costs. And then when he sells the house to the ultimate buyer.
Yes.
So that development of providing a house is paying not 9%, but it's paying 18%.
Right. Before I come to Sue, Dr. Dana Morris Dixon, you were nodding in agreement with something you want to say?
No, I was actually agreeing in relation to the reduced supply that we have, or the limited supply of housing that we have at the lower levels. I mean, when I look at our data, it's looking, and the average mortgage is about 13 million. And obviously that's not for your majority of your working Jamaicans. The majority of them are not at that price point. And even at that price point, that's not, it's not affordable for a lot of people. And even when we look at a lot of the new developments, you're seeing it. A lot of those new developments are priced outside of even professionals. And and what the minister said is that there has to be some drive towards that lower end of the market. I don't like using the word incentives. I mean, there are different ways to incentivize things, and I think one way to do it is through the abolition of the taxes. But there also have to be other ways of stimulating supply at that level.
Thank you. Sue, your question from Slido. Stand up for me, please. Give me your proper name and ask your question.
Yes.
Let's just make sure.
My name is Johnson, Courtney Johnson. I would like to know, it's about the CAPEX, the capital expenditure.
Sue.
And it was mentioned in the
Sue,
stats.
hold on a second. Is that your question on, that's your question here?
Yes.
Is it? You have to show me.
C. Johnson.
Your name is what?
C. Johnson.
C. Johnson? Well, that's not the one I had, but go ahead and I'll see what you have on your phone. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
One of the statistics that I just did not understand. So I need some sort of elaboration on it. And perhaps any of the panelists can. Why is the capital, the stat was the capital expenditure for the capital expenditure as a percentage of the GDP was lower in Jamaica than nearly all the countries in the Caribbean except one. Remember, the graph was moving, so I just don't remember them. But Haiti, for example, it was even lower than Haiti. What is the explanation for that? It would be helpful for me to know why is that so?
Sure. Let me just. So the graph that I showed capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the size of the economy. And the principal reason why Jamaica has been lower than our colleague countries in the region for a very long time has been because we have had extraordinarily high and unsustainable debt. That's the... Yes, way higher than Haiti. Haiti has other problems, but they don't have our problem of very high debt, of certainly 147% debt. Does that answer your question? So what we're saying is that going forward, we need for us to change our environment, for the government to deliver on what we all want in terms of sanitation and garbage collection and schools and hospitals and police stations, fire stations and the computer systems and response times and mobile apps. All of those require capital expenditure.
What I mean is get the impression that the capital investment
as a percentage, don't get hung up on Haiti alone. As a percentage of GDP, several of the countries in the region, when that was done in 2017, had higher percentage of their GDP represented by capital expenditure than Jamaica's had, which is not surprising. Not surprising, right? That's just a historical reality. We see it. We see it. Yeah?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Sue, on Slido, if I can't see Sue, let me ask Sue's question. What is the long-term plan to mitigate against having to dedicate such a large chunk of the budget to security rather than social services, among others, Minister?
No, excellent question. Excellent question. That is the question, right? That security has, or lack of security has got ahead of us for such a long time that bringing it into any degree of normality is going to require resources, and it's going to require significant resources. But the dividend from normalizing security, every study shows, whether it be the IDB or the World Bank or other studies, even our local studies, shows that the dividend from normalization of crime would be very, very significant. So it's a worthwhile investment, both economically and socially. You have to remember as well that, you know, security is social expenditure. I mean, it wasn't included in Damon's chart. But remember, who does the lack of security affect most? Who? Where do these serial, abominable acts take place? Are they taking place in wealthy Kingston or on the villas of Montego Bay? No. They're taking place in socially and economically vulnerable communities. So security in our context is social expenditure and affects the lives of those among us who are least resourced. So compassion demands that we forcefully address security. And that is what we have set out to do with the unprecedented expenditure on security in this budget.
Doctor,
it's very easy to ignore that there is a connection between these abstract concepts that we discussed, debt and stability and inflation, and the effect on people's lives. So I'm very glad that the minister made that connection. There's also another connection, by the way, with inflation. But one of the things that you notice in Jamaica and in many other countries is that the correlation between the inflation rate and the incidence of poverty is inverse. That whenever the inflation rate goes up, not inverse, it's direct. Whenever the inflation rate goes up, poverty goes up. When inflation rate comes down, poverty comes down. And Jamaica's poverty rate has actually come down over the last few years as the inflation rate has come down. Because inflation is largely a tax on people who don't own property. It is a tax on people whose wealth, what little wealth they have, is largely in the form of money. And so the bringing down of inflation to low single digits itself is a kind of a social program. It certainly has extraordinary benefits on poverty.
Thank you, Dr. King. Talking about bringing down something, Dr. Dana Morris-Dixon, when are you bringing down mortgage rates, interest rates?
We have already, that's a great question. I think we have already done so, and I think that's obviously coming from government policies too. If you look at the Bank of Jamaica rates, significantly decreased, and so we have decreased our mortgage rates across the board, but we've also had to be innovative. So the minister is being innovative with his intergenerational mortgages. We've had to be innovative because one of the things we found was that for a lot of young professionals, they couldn't find the down payment. So we've had to put in place mortgages where we also assist with the down payment for the home. We have looked at variable rates versus fixed rates. So we've been doing a lot of things. But you ask about bringing it down even further.
Yes.
And there is one point that I guess I can make at this point, if we look in the financial sector, one of the things in the minister's budget presentation that he pointed out was the asset tax elimination for non-financial companies. Now, for all financial companies, we have to pay that asset tax.
Oh, no.
I
know where this is going.
I know you know where this is going. And there has been no reduction in the asset tax on financial institutions. And I think it's very important for us to also look at how we can further stimulate interest rates to go down. And I think they're going down and across the board. But I think the asset tax, if the minister were to look at that, I think there would be significant decreases in interest rates because the asset tax is an important tax and it is a very expensive tax for financial institutions.
Right.
And I could also note our reserve requirements, because in some countries what they do in order to stimulate loans to particular sectors, so for example housing, you want to have more housing loans, what they do is give differential capital reserve requirements for banks so that they can reduce the interest rates there. So there are things that can be done, and we're in dialogue with the government on that. But I expect that you are going to see even more reductions in interest rates. The macroeconomic stability that we see is exceptionally important, and it is going to lead to more reductions.
Right, because if we don't get it, we are refinancing with the institutions.
And the minister has made it much easier for you to do so too, and so that is important to point out.
Great. We have 5 minutes to go. This gentleman had a question. Whilst he comes with his question, and I'm going to have the panelists wrap. Dr. Damien King Anonymous wants to know, if you were Minister of Finance, what would you have done differently?
Well, the first thing I would have done, the first thing I would do is I would ask Nigel Clark if you were interested in taking my job. But I will confess that I had articulated that the two priorities that I had worked out for myself before the budget was one, making the economy more flexible. Now, we talk about the reduction in transfer tax as facilitating investment. But it's not a one-off benefit, that economies are dynamic things. The world is changing, industries are expanding, opportunities are closing and opening. And so the most important thing for an economy to have is the ability to shift resources around. If I may add as a footnote here, anybody who pays attention to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, which is in deep trouble, the principal problem in that economy is the rigidity, its inability to move resources out of old industries and into new ones. That is a problem that all economies face because opportunities change all the time. Yes. So I would look precisely at making the economy more flexible in ways that allows resources to shift. That's the transfer tax. The other area that I would have focused on is it is going to be a limit, the argument to pay more attention to the marginalized, the economically and socially marginalized, is important from every dimension. It is a potential economic constraint on the growth that we are expecting. It is a social risk if we don't pay attention to it, and it's a moral obligation. So had I been Minister of Finance, I would have tried to put more resources into social programs, and in particular into the PATH program.
And that is more than
as it happens,
has been put?
As it happens,
yes.
I don't need to take the job because that is precisely what has happened.
Oh, okay. Got you. Final question from this gentleman here. Yes, sir, introduce yourself.
My name is Selvin Bailey. I'm also in education. My question to you, Dr. Nigel Clark. We are speaking about removing the transfer tax. and I'm seeing where you're going to lose a lot of revenues. What are the plans to fill that gap? Could it be, just what are the plans to fill that gap?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So it's a net reduction. It's a net reduction. So we have reduced those taxes, and we don't need to collect them. I don't know if I've answered your question. It's a net reduction. That's what it is. I know it's hard to understand because we don't have a history, unfortunately.
No, but
the
budget is going to, the budget you have proposed is not going to be a deficit. You're not going to end up with less revenue than the expenditure. So what is it that allows you to be able to reduce a tax rate and forego $14 billion?
Yeah, and so we have used the buoyancy in revenues, and that buoyancy in revenues has allowed us to say, hey, if we have these revenues today, vis-a-vis what we had yesterday, we don't need this component here in order to deliver what we need to deliver. Okay? And in the context of a Jamaica that has had challenges with growing, that has had challenges with generating transaction and business activity, that has challenges with its efficiency. We're trying to make the economy, as Dr. King mentioned, more efficient so that more transactions can happen, transaction volumes can increase, activity can increase, and the economy can grow on a more sustained basis and hopefully at a higher rate.
Thank you, Doc. Dr. Dana Morris-Dixon, you're 1 minute to wrap up. 1 minute to you, Dr. Nigel Clark, and 1 minute to Dr. Damien King.
I'll go last.
Except I'm the moderator, and I've said you go second. Dr. Dana Morris-Dixon.
I think the priorities, as we saw, in terms of national security, CAPEX, and I obviously throw in the small business piece because that was very, very important, and I think we can't lose sight of it, and housing were very important pieces. And the theme today is path, police, and patty shops, and we talked a lot about path and police, but we didn't talk so much about the patty shops. And for me, a patty shop, and I think of patties in Jamaica, that's an innovation on our part. And how do we get more innovations to flourish? How do we get more entrepreneurship? Because the government is not going to bring us into prosperity. We have to take ourselves there. And I think it's through looking at our educational policies, looking at how we get capital to these small, innovative, patty shop type people that will project where we're going to go in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dana. Give her a round of applause. Morris-Dixon. Dr. Nigel Clark.
If I may.
So the men love to gang up, you see? Go right ahead. I will submit.
At the risk of ending on a controversial note, I would like to suggest that as much as we have spent time talking about housing, that what we have in Jamaica is not a problem that housing is too costly. Because the same majority of the country who has difficulty affording housing has difficulty affording transportation, has difficulty affording school, has uniforms and books. The problem we have is that most of our population earns too little. And that makes living too expensive. And so instead of focusing on the manifestation, one manifestation that housing is too expensive, a lot of the focus has rightly gone on stability and efficiency and flexibility and ease of starting a business so that therefore incomes can rise.
Well, you asked to go last, you better top that. Dr. Nigel Clark, your 1 minute.
Firstly, Emily, thank you, CAPRI, for having this. At the end of the day, the budget represents the people's resources, right? And accounting to the people for how the resources are being spent is a crucial principle of our democracy. We have tried to support that with the first publication by the Ministry of Finance of a citizen's budget printed in daily newspapers for several 100,000, millions possibly, to see how the government is spending their money. Jamaica is a country coming from a long period of fiscal duress, and there are significant constraints. No one budget can do everything, and in the context of constraints, we have to choose priorities. This government set out in its economic reform program, signed with the fund back in 2016, established the priorities as releasing fiscal space to ensure that we had sufficient resources to spend on ways of generating economic activity, of providing security, and at the same time of protecting the vulnerable. And that is exactly what we have done. The resources that we have diverted, or we have channeled into those areas, and channeled in a significant way in response to what the people themselves, what you have said are your priorities.
Thank you. Really excellent panelists, Doctors Dana Morris-Dixon, Dr. Damian King, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark. Final round of applause for them. Big thank you. It's the first time I'm using Slido, this interactive tool, and I think it really worked. So thank you to the CAPRI team for bringing this interactive social media, but actually present people in the room asking questions. And those of you who joined us on Twitter and on the website capricaribbean.org, we thank you so much. Let's invite Stephen Facey, the chairman of CAPRI, back, and have yourselves a good evening from me. I'm Emily Shields.
Thank you, Emily. I think you'll all agree this has been a very interesting session, and a refreshing one compared perhaps to past budgets and past presentations. I think we want to thank you, Minister. A great first innings. Yes. I think we'll all agree that the matter of the ministry and our resources are in a safe pair of hands, and we look forward to more in the future. I want to offer I'm sure you want to offer our appreciation to CAPRI, led by Dr. King and all the staff at CAPRI for yet again a well-considered presentation, and for helping us to understand the complexities of the budget in remarkably simple terms. Dr. King. A lot of doctors.
Dana.
Dr. Dana Morris-Dixon, thank you. Thank you to JN for your support and continuing support of CAPRI, and we look forward to your continued support in the future. And of course, Emily, it wouldn't have been the same without you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I know getting here was difficult today, but thank you for your perseverance, for participating. We look forward to seeing you again at CAPRI's next event, and safe travel on your way home. Good night.